welcome to Louis Loves Mini's mini lesson, where you take a miniature part of your time to teach you a small step on how to paint and build a miniature. Now in the previous episode I did say that we will be priming this guy, but I had actually forgotten an important step, and that is to base our miniatures. Basing a miniature can actually be really simple when you have the right products. And you really want to base a miniature because most of the time you don't get a come on dude. But most of the time you want to base a miniature because you don't always have a base that has a sculpt like this, which has like little terrain, little figurines. Most of the time you have a black flat base. Now before we add anything to this base, let's go mount it onto a holder for us to handle it a little bit better in the same way that we handle our miniatures. And this is just blue tack that we will be putting on a little old wooden toy or wooden block, and now we can hold the entire thing without having to touch it and ruining a potential paint job in the future. So we're basically looking at texture paint. And there are two texture paints that I normally use as texture paint products. One from Vallejo, which is I think to be cheaper because the price of one bottle of this is maybe 2 bottles of this from Games Workshop. And you still get more amount than the Citadel bottles, which is I believe to be 24 ml. So 224 mls, which is 48 mls versus 200 ml. Not bad. And I'll be showing you the difference of some of these textures on this single base. Now do keep in mind there is a wide array of texture paints out there, and they all achieve different effects and colors. I personally like to apply the texture base or texture paint before we paint because I can influence how this white color is on the actual end result. These paint textures are designed to be used after the paint job. That means when your paint is done, you'll be stuck with a brown or you'll be stuck with a white. Thankfully, these texture paints are acrylic, so that means you can easily just put acrylic on acrylic as if it was normal paint. Now these are plastic sculpting tools. You can also use maybe dentist tools. You can just get these in any online stores. You can even use a toothpick or an old brush if you like. I like using a sculpting tool because it has a flat little portion, and you can see over here, this is the guy I use all the time. I have a little flat applicator and scooper, and then I have a little poker, and I'll show you how I use both of these. Now let's go with our texture paint of Vallejo. This is a thin ground texture, and as you can see, I am actually almost done with this bottle. You grab a few, just a few. Actually, this is too much already. Grab your base and just dollop that over there. Normally you'd cover a majority of the base, but because this base has some texture, I will just be covering a portion of it and only showing you how it looks at the very end. So just to double check, I drilled this hole to know where the Space Marine goes later on, so I know as to not cover that hole. Notice how I just scooped that thing and then flattened it in the flat edge. And if I want to sculpt it a little bit more and maybe push it into different nooks and crannies, I get a sharper stick or thing and prodder and just sculpt it like that. Maybe I could even influence a little hill by moving it upwards like this. Now I have like a random standing up piece of dirt that will eventually dry. I don't know why I have that, but to demonstrate, you can sculpt this as it is still wet. So this is also safe on your fingers, and I actually like to pass my finger on the rim just to keep that rim clean. Let me show you some thick mud and see the difference on that. Thick mud is as how it sounds. It's thicker. You actually have the semblance of some grass that's wet in there, which is kind of cool. I don't know if you'll be able to see it. So let's just get a small portion and place that on our base. I'll put him in the front over there. And you can already see the difference in the clumps. The thick mud has visibly bigger clumps, whereas the previous texture has a more sand feel. And again, I could just maybe flatten it like that and push it a little bit if I want to make more adjustments as it dries. GWs may be small, but it has effects that really are quite cool. This one has a cracking earth effect. Just open that up. Let's grab a scoop. Remember to wipe your scooper before you scoop into new texture paint. I actually recommend using different texture paints on the same base just to insinuate that earthy randomness. So this one has a nice effect of it end up being like cracked up earth. And for most GW bases, you actually want it to be a bit thicker than the usual to achieve that certain cracked earth effect. Take note, not all of Games Workshop's texture paints have that cracked earth effect, but this one does. But anyway, you can look up a chart. I'll link that in the comments so you can see how the different texture paints from Games Workshop dries up. Now, before you set this down to dry, you also have the chance to put some greeblies on your base, and that really just adds more realism and texture. Now, again, we're not just adding basing for the sake of basing. We're adding basing because we want to tell a story. Super glue some cork onto the base to add like an extra level or layer. I'm not going to do it this miniature. Maybe I'll add like a little random rock over here at the back, and as it's drying, I'll just press that in. That rock is pressed into the sand, and as the sand will dry, that will actually be bonded together. Some people like to super glue their bits before they add the texture. It adds more realism that the mud is covering whatever bit is on there. And when I say bits, I'm talking about old toys, old junk. I'm talking about actual bits from your bits box. It could be anything to just color up or to create a story on your figure. And I will show you some examples of that later on. For now, let's dry up our bait. I normally leave this overnight, but for demonstration purposes, let's also share a quick tip, which is the hair dryer. This hair dryer will basically speed up time in the drying process. You also want to be careful because this can be very hot, and when you're pointing it at skin, you will feel like you're getting burned because it does mean you are getting burned. Make sure you're pointing it just at the plastic and at the acrylic that you're trying to dry. And yes, word of caution, because this is plastic, if you blow dry it too much with too high a temperature, you could actually kind of melt the plastic you are trying to dry. So be careful with it. Do it in passes. Dry only when necessary. Of course, you can also set like the whole thing down and just like point the blow dryer from there. He's actually dried, and you can already tell and see that Games Workshop texture paint has some cracks that it didn't have before. The moisture is gone, and now it really looks like a dry patch of dirt. Most of the time, you would see hobbyists apply this in the very last because they're very happy with that effect. I personally like to paint over that so that I could keep some areas different and then cover them all up with paint. Let me show you an example. This one is using the same materials, the Vallejo texture paint over here, the Vallejo texture paint over here, and that Games Workshop texture paint. And then they're all on top of this cork board. I glued the cork board, I glued some sculpted bases given to me by a friend, and I covered all the hideous pieces or pieces that made it look fake with some texture paint. Now, texture paint or basing a miniature is not just there to make your mini look cool, but it's also there to tell a story. And this is the base of a Black Templar unit, and I want it to look like it's a tiled base that's also war torn with some technological stuff. So I used bits of sprue as my junk and bits, and I glued that to the base. Then I added some rocks and texture paint just to make the connection more seamless in the sides, and added this little weird greebly to make it look like it's a little bit futuristic and whatnot. You can also use it to tell more interesting stories, like how this dreadnought is trudging through a battlefield. And this paint job is not yet done, but you can see I put an old bit of terrain over here. I don't know if you can see it, but I put some old plastic bits here, and I even put a lot of different terrain and leveled cork and rocks to just make it look like he's crunching through that war-torn terrain. When I paint this guy up later on, it's going to look really great. Now, the thing is, all this mud and texture, I made that using different the texture paints that I've showed you, and that adds that variation. You can save a lot of money by just buying the same types of texture paints and then painting them afterwards. Because normally you can actually buy this ground texture in different colors, but they're the same texture. Just get one texture, a thin, a thick, something that doesn't crack, and then something that cracks. Then you just cover it up with different bits and toys to tell a story or make your miniature look coolio. Thanks for watching. I hope my head fits over here. Oh my gosh, that's just my eyeball. Anyway, go tell a story. I hope you enjoyed this short video. Base before you paint. Add some greeblies. Make it look cool. Tell a story. And it's very, very easy when you have the right products. Make it look cool, guys. This is Louie. Louie Loves Me. He's reminding you to hobby every day to keep the sprues away.